if you are relying on access to your GLP-1 therapy from outside the regulatory system, I mean gray market versions or even compound versions, what was said just yesterday by RFK Jr. is probably going to make you feel pretty uncomfortable. And ironically, at the same time that access from sort of outside the branded option world is getting squeezed tighter and tighter, one of the most powerful versions of these drugs we've ever seen just proved how powerful it can be for diabetics. I'm talking about Retatrutide and some clinical trial data that was released this week. And all the while, the companies behind this are starting to shift their focus to new therapies. We're talking about non-incretin therapies. And I think that's an exciting topic. And these are all three things that we're going to get into on today's episode of the Weekly Dose Podcast. Welcome back.
Welcome to the On the Pen podcast with your host, Dave Knapp.
Welcome back to the Weekly Dose Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Knapp, man on the Manjaro. That's why I'm here, and you are on the pen. Retatrutide, Wegovy, Saxenda, Victoza, Trulicity, Manjaro, Zepbound, compound, research grade, whatever brings you here. Likely it's the chronic and relapsing disease of obesity. And if that's you and you're living with that disease and you felt flat out shut out by your doctor, we hope that you'll check out our sponsor, our podcast sponsor, Shed, and give them a try to help you along on your journey, because TriShed understands explicitly that obesity is a chronic, relapsing, and multifactorial disease, and that it requires a lot of tools in the tool belt to help you get to where you want to get in terms of your health journey. And so I hope that you'll give our sponsor Shed a try if that's you, and use code OTP25 to save 25% off your obesity treatment. Give them a try and let them know that you appreciate them sponsoring this podcast so that we can bring this to you each and every week. Thank you to our sponsors over at Shed. Now, as I sort of teed this up at the beginning, there is some interesting stuff to get into in terms of the statements made yesterday on the Bostix podcast by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, he made some comments that I think are likely, especially in light of what we shared on last week's podcast. We talked about how the compound versions are sort of getting squeezed from a couple different directions. The demonstrable difficulties to compound list, which there could be regulatory action by the FDA coming soon on that. And perhaps maybe what Secretary Kennedy said here could be some insight into, maybe which direction they're going to move on that. But he also made comments about research grade peptides and what created sort of the climate that is there for them. So we're going to watch a little bit of this interview again from the Bostix podcast. So thank you to them for this enlightening interview. Let's hear from Secretary Kennedy and let's talk about it.
The GLPs, now the companies are producing. There was a shortage of GLPs for a while. And so you had the compounding pharmacies make it because they could legally make it during the shortage. Now there's no shortage. And not only that, but the price has now dropped dramatically. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're going to not see, and we're also now enforcing against the compounders who are doing mass marketing, which they're not legally allowed to do anyway. The compounders are supposed to be for doctors who prescribe an individual patient a unique formulation of that particular molecule.
For that specific patient.
Yeah, that the patient can't get off the shelf because the shelf, it'll make it in 50 milligrams or 10 milligrams. And let's say you need 30 milligrams. The compounder will make it like that.
So this is obviously an interesting thing for Secretary Kennedy to highlight. And I want to just break that down for a second. So he talks about the shortages and how the shortages proliferated GLP-1 compounding. And he talked about how those shortages are now over. The shortages are over, and essentially highlights, I think, what he believes to be a loophole in terms of the compounds that continue to exist and are mass marketed today for various different purposes, right? And he highlights the fact that some people have an allergy and that some people potentially can need a dose that isn't allowed through the branded options. And he highlights those as, the traditional way that compounding is supposed to be used, and highlights the issue of mass marketing of these types of compounds. So tirzepatide plus B12 or semaglutide in a different dosing. And so he highlights those and really says that they're going to be going after the mass marketing. Now, I think that's just a nod to a lot of the letters that they saw go out over the last couple of, I think it was back in February, we saw about 30 letters go out to different telehealth companies and compounders. And so I think he's just underscoring that. But he goes on to talk about research grade. And I want to get into this a little bit. So let's hear a little bit more from Secretary Kennedy on this topic.
Allergies, he'll make it with a twist so that doesn't provoke an allergic reaction. So I think the GLPs people are going to be getting from the manufacturers. That's the safest thing, because the API plants that actually make the components of that GLP are inspected by the FDA. They're mainly in China or India. We inspect them. With peptides, that market was thrown into chaos because the Biden administration illegally moved 19 peptides to category 2, and category 2 says do not formulate. So
is that like a BPC 157, all those things?
Yeah, those were moved. And so you had ethical compounders who were buying legal API from FDA inspected plants. We shut them all down, and we created a black market where people are selling peptides for research purposes and for animal purposes, but they're marketing to be humans through influencers. And that's illegal. You can't do that.
So really interesting here. So essentially what you have here is RFK Jr. laying out the case that he believes that the black market for peptides were essentially created by way of the Biden administration moving around 20 peptides from category 1 to category 2. And it's not really important for you to understand the nitty gritty of all that, but just know that when something's in category 1, it can be compounded. A doctor can prescribe it, and a compound pharmacy can make and fill it. They, of course, have to source their API through FDA regulated channels. Now, when those peptides were moved to category 2, essentially it made it so that they couldn't be compounded. And so when people wanted to go get something like BPC 157, they had to go to the gray market if they wanted to get the injectable version. And so it created this gray market, or as Secretary Kennedy refers to it here, the black market for research grade chemicals, which are marketed as not for human consumption. I haven't seen any that are marketed for animal research. In fact, I feel like a lot of them say that they're not explicitly, but not for human consumption and research grade. And he calls this this proliferation of the black market illegal, specifically calling out using influencers to push research grade chemicals as illegal and saying you can't do that. So I think that this is a signal, likely, if you're somebody who relies on, let's say, research grade versions of Retatrutide, and you have gotten that vis-a-vis an influencer on TikTok who has pushed you in that direction, I think this is signaling that there is likely some enforcement to be done in this space in terms of the crackdown on this gray market, because in their estimation, what they're doing is moving these peptides to category 1 and legitimizing them again, allowing them to be compounded, allowing them to be prescribed by physicians. And so in sort of bringing the peptides back under government control, it sounds like anyway, that they intend to crack down on the non-regulated versions. And so I think that there's a bit of a signal in here if you listen to what Secretary Kennedy had to say there. Now, if you want to check out that full interview, it's an interesting interview with the Bostics. I think it's called the Him and Her Show. It's available over on YouTube. I highly recommend you give that full interview a listen if you want just that part of the actual podcast. I believe it starts at about the 1 hour and 14-minute mark if you want to give that a listen. But a very interesting conversation and very interesting signal. Again, we talked last week about the crackdown of regulated compound versions of GLP-1s in terms of the demonstrably difficult to compound list, in terms of what Lilly came out and published about the potential for tirzepatide to fuse with B12 and become a singular molecule, and what that could potentially do to patients in terms of immunologic reactions or changes in efficacy, things like that. So we see this move by the FDA and some signals that just seem to be indicating a movement back to the drug manufacturers. You heard in there, Secretary Kennedy said that patients should by and large be on the branded versions of these medications, talks about the price reduction that we've seen in those medications. And certainly, if you go back to when the shortages did exist, the cost of these medications were much higher. The list price for tirzepatide, I believe, was Zepbound and Mounjaro was right up there, $1,100. Now we see the cash pay offerings through Lilly Direct now under $500. If you're cash paying for these medications, still squeezes the folks in the middle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I think what we're seeing here is a signal to move a lot of these non-branded versions and patients who are relying on these non-branded versions back to the branded versions of these medications. I want to take a moment. If you're enjoying the podcast here, would you hit the hype button down below and let me know in the comments if you do so? The hype button is something that helps this video to trend on YouTube so that other people can discover the content that we make here. So if you find what we do here valuable at On the Pen, my ask of you is that you go to the description of this video and hit the hype button, HYPE, and you can go back and do that 3 different times. It kind of looks like you can only do that once, but you can do it 3 different times per week. Our ask is that you would hit that hype button and help this trend on YouTube. Also hit the thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed yet and you've made it 11 minutes into this podcast, it means we've provided some sort of value. We'd love your subscribe as well. So thank you to all those who have already done all that. And thank you to those who show up every week to this podcast. Really, really appreciate you. Now let's talk about Retatrutide. Retatrutide is Eli Lilly's pronunciation of this molecule. Retatrutide is the, by and large, much preferred pronunciation. And if you have been here at On the Pen for the last 3 years, as we've talked about this molecule, it's Retatrutide. But Retatrutide is really, really exciting. And it has been for a long time, but now we're to the point where we're getting phase 3 data on Retatrutide. We got some phase 3 data in osteoarthritis and obesity just a couple of months ago. We learned that patients are losing up to 30% of their body weight, just insane results. We're talking about like bariatric surgery level results. But what about folks with type 2 diabetes? Because as we've seen throughout all the clinical trials for GLP-1 medications, as I've seen in my own personal story, generally people with type 2 diabetes really struggle to lose weight, especially in the clinical trials for GLP-1s. They lose much less weight on average than patients who are non-diabetic. That's why a lot of times you'll see these drug companies split these trials between obese patients and obese patients with diabetes. But Retatrutide is not just another GLP-1. It's triple agonist. And that means that it's hitting 3 different hormones. So the early versions of these medications, whether we're talking about exenatide or liraglutide or dulaglutide or the more popular semaglutide, those were all single-acting GLP-1 receptor agonists. And then tirzepatide came along, Mounjaro and Zepbound, and that hits the GIP receptors, which is another incretin hormone. And it also hits GIP. I call it GIP with a GLP-1 kicker, right? Retatrutide is like that in that it hits the GLP-1 receptors. It hits the GIP receptors even more so, but it also hits a third receptor called glucagon. And that third piece, the glucagon, is really what sets it apart, because all of the incretin drugs that we had prior to Retatrutide all focused on reducing energy intake. In other words, you eat less on these medications, and so your calorie deficit is increased. But because glucagon is actually a cardiac stimulant, so it revs up your heart and it revs up your metabolism, it's tied to energy expenditure, not just appetite. So now you're not just eating less, you're actually burning more at the same time. It's the first drug of its kind that hits both of those targets, the energy intake and the energy expenditure. Now let's talk about these numbers from this diabetes trial, because this is where it gets really exciting. So A1C dropped from a baseline of around 7.9% 2 full percentage points. Now, that's not as great as tirzepatide is. And you might be like, why? Shouldn't it be better? Well, I think over the long term, as you'll see, people will lose more weight with retatrutide. So you could see that number come down, over the long haul. But because it has that glucagon component, glucagon is something that ultimately can raise the level of sugars in your blood. And so it's sort of counterintuitive to a diabetes medication by adding that, right? But it also has the GLP-1 GIP that are helping your body be more efficient with your insulin production. And so I believe that we could see that number come down over time with retatrutide because the weight loss will be so much better. And weight loss is one of the best things you can do to bring your blood sugars down. But the weight loss in this trial hit 16.8% at the top dose of 12 milligrams, which is about 36.6 pounds on average. And this was only a 40-week trial. So unlike the Surmount trials for tirzepatide, which were 72 weeks, this was just a 40-week trial. But the detail that actually matters more than the headlines of 17% weight loss is that this was a 40-week study in type 2 diabetics who lose less historically compared to these medications, but they weren't plateauing at 40 weeks, meaning there was still runway to lose more weight. And that's big for diabetics because diabetics typically not only they lose weight to a lesser extent, but they also plateau earlier on these charts. And they have more metabolic resistance, except in this trial with retatrutide, you don't see a plateau yet at 40 weeks. So the weight loss was still trending down at the end of this study, which suggests that we may not have seen the ceiling at 17% weight loss for retatrutide. You may get up to more ultimately the 22% like you see with tirzepatide in the non-diabetic patient population. So it really holds a lot of promise to those who have struggled on the current treatments for type 2 diabetes when it comes to the weight loss part, because you're not only trying to address a lot for most of us, not only trying to address the issue of glucose control and blood sugar control, but you're trying to get the weight down too. Right? Because most of us live with the chronic and relapsing disease of obesity along with our type 2 diabetes. Now let's talk a little bit about tolerability because that matters too when we're talking about these medications. So you're still seeing very similar side effects as to what we see with across the entire class of nutrient stimulated hormones or incretin mimetics, however you want to catch it. You see nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, some of those GI side effects. So it's still not magic. It comes with, some trade-offs, but the discontinuation rates on this were still relatively low, which means that the side effects were tolerable enough that most people still stuck with it, right? There was no major signal here. Now, here's where this kind of ties back to everything that we've been talking about today, because again, a lot of people already know about retatrutide because of not the clinical trials or the clinical trial data, although we brought you information from like Mimi, who was in one of the retatrutide trials. It's from what's been circulating around in the gray market. We just interviewed a guy named Ben who, had no choice but to go to the gray market and ended up really turning his life around and his health around with the use of gray market research grade versions of retatrutide. But you think about the timing of all this, which is where I feel like the conversation gets a little bit interesting, because you see that pathway of gray market peptides sort of being squeezed, really, more aggressive approach to talking about these publicly from both the regulators, in terms of like Secretary Kennedy. And you also see more aggressive language around research grade versions from the pharmaceutical companies who have historically just tried to kind of lump all of these together, compound, research grade, one and the same. You see that this is all, kind of bubbling to the surface and getting more aggressive at the same time that we're getting data on retatrutide, and the approval of it is right around the corner, right? We'll probably see this in the next 12 months. So while it's proving itself to be probably the most powerful metabolic modulating drug that we've ever seen in existence, we also see that folks who have been getting it from the gray market starting to get squeezed and starting to go, what direction am I going to turn if I lose access to this? So it's very interesting to watch, and we're going to cover that all as it unfolds here at On the Pen. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you never miss an update, because we're live actually Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays on our YouTube channel at 11 a.m. Central, 12 p.m. Eastern, every single Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can find that at otplinks.com. That's where you can find literally everything that we talk about on this podcast at otplinks.com. You can find all of our socials, and we share a little bit something different on each of the social media channels that we follow. In fact, if you don't have our newsletter, you can go to obesity.news, type that into your browser, obesity.news, put your email in, and you'll get email alerts right to your inbox. We do a lot of updating there. But low key, one of the most breaking news channels that we manage here is our Twitter. And so you can also follow us on X at @manonthepen. Again, all of the social media channels that we're on can be found at otplinks.com. Now let's talk about this final shift, because this is where we get into like talking about the future beyond incretins and how some of these drug companies are already looking beyond, even the most powerful drug that we've seen in Retatrutide so far. Let's talk about LX9851, because this is where Novo's looking. While the incretins continue to push farther and farther, Novo just kind of stepped outside the framework a little bit and licensed, and they actually licensed this about a year ago, LX9851, but moved into this drug into phase 1 clinical trials this week. And I want to explain why this is actually low key, even though it's not widely covered, a really interesting story, because the drug targets something called ACSL5. And it's an enzyme involved in how your body processes fatty acids, stores fat, and regulates your energy balance. This is a non-incretin drug. So this is not something that's a GLP-1 or GIP, or even though glucagon, I don't believe that glucagon or amylin are incretins. Somebody can fact check me on that. But they're nutrient stimulated hormones. ACSL5 is an enzyme in your body that, again, processes fatty acid and stores fat and regulates energy balance. And the key is that this came from genetic knockout models, meaning when scientists removed this enzyme in mice, they saw lower body fat and preservation of lean muscle mass. So this is what they saw in mice. So then they combined this medication, this LX9851, with semaglutide in mice, and found that it helped to reduce visceral fat even further than semaglutide alone. It helped to preserve muscle mass along the way, which is sort of, when you look at the trials, semaglutide is sort of the worst offender when it comes to the clinical trial data and the lean mass loss, right? It's up there around 30%, I believe. It's closer to 20% with tirzepatide. Again, fact check me on those numbers, because I'm just pulling them off the top of my head. But I think that when it comes to semaglutide, this could be an interesting answer to that. And they also found that when the mice went off the semaglutide, they maintained much better and continued to lose in some cases and preserve that muscle mass when they came off. So what we're talking about is solving sort of a different problem. Not how do we lose weight, but how do we lose fat without sacrificing muscle and lean mass, which is always a topic of conversation that I get excited about discussing here, because what an amazing world that we live in, that the conversation, even in 3.5 years since I started talking about this, can shift from get the weight down to the quality of weight loss. Because we're really, with like the data that I just shared about Retatrutide, we're so close at having a molecule or a combination of molecules. When you think about eloralintide and cagrilintide, these amylin analogs from Lilly and Novo, that will ultimately be stacked with drugs like tirzepatide or semaglutide or even Retatrutide to help patients to achieve optimal amount of weight loss. The fact that the options are going to be so vast in the near future for patients to get their weight down, that the conversation could shift to something about how do we also improve the quality of that weight loss, and how do we help people maintain that weight loss, sort of approaching these new frontiers of obesity medicine that we now actually have the ability to talk about and discuss, because it's a reality for so many patients. I think that's really, really exciting, because at the end of the day, that shows me that within my lifetime, we really could see obesity become a disease of the past and something that in hindsight just views so archaic, and that we can't believe that people were let to live that way for so long. And so I get very excited about things like uh, the future of these medications and things that focus on things like muscle preservation, the quality of weight loss, and helping people to maintain, because it means we're that much closer to an option that's going to help you and slower responders to the current therapies like me get to where we want to be. It's just a further indication of that. So I'm really excited about this because ultimately at the end of the day, we have a evidence here that this drug here from Novo Nordisk could actually activate the ileal brake. It's a gut mechanism that slows gastric emptying, increases satiety, reduces food intake, which is similar to what GLP-1s do, but with, activating a totally different pathway. And now you've also got something that can do those things potentially, but also at the same time reduce fat mass and preserve muscle mass. I'm so excited about this one. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Novo has spent about $1 billion when you factor in milestone payments to license this thing globally, and it entered phase 1. And I think that that's a huge step forward for patients living with the disease of obesity. So when we zoom out on this whole conversation today, access is tightening outside of the regulatory system. We talk a lot about how things have improved for patients. We see this direct to consumer advent. We see so many people being able to access the branded versions of these medications because of the prices coming down direct to consumer. So what I think is happening is in this country, we take care of the people on the margins pretty well. Like you have super wealthy people that are, price for these medications is never going to be an issue. And then on the other spectrum, we have the elderly folks on a fixed income. We have, folks who are living, at the poverty levels that have the access to Medicaid. And we have some solves for that coming up later this year, which we've covered in basically the Medicare bridge and balance models that will be rolling out. I think this 2027 is going to be great access for Medicaid patients. So we take care of the people on the fringes, but the people in the middle are the ones that get squeezed the most. And I think that while we're seeing the people in the middle narrow because of the price reductions in the direct to consumer, we're still seeing a lot of people in that middle. There's a ton of you. Is that you? Let me know in the comments who hear, that's great that the cost of these medications are going down, but it's still unaffordable for me. And I don't qualify for Medicare. I don't qualify for Medicaid. I'm not of Medicare age. So what am I supposed to do? And the options that you rely on, whether it's the research grade or it's the compound versions, are continuing to get squeezed. And so it just seems like a travesty that the folks in the middle are the ones that are, have the hardest decisions to make and get squeezed the hardest. So do you feel like things are getting better? Because ultimately what appears to be happening is that control is increasing over these medications. And while the pot in the middle seems to be narrowing and it seems to be less people that are there, there's still a lot of people in that middle. Let me know if that's you, and let me know what you think about how everything is heading and how everything is shaking out. I really appreciate you hanging out with me today. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being the best part of what we do at On the Pen. Make sure you hit the thumbs up button and drop a comment below. Let me know what you thought about the podcast. And if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review. That helps us so much on the audio platforms. And it's literally how we pay our bills here, is the growth of the podcast. So when we talk about our sponsors like Shed, literally it's the podcast. It's the podcast. So please, the hype button, the like, save, share, and the 5-star review are all things that you can do today that cost you nothing to help us continue this movement here that we've started it On the Pen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being the best part of what we do. And we'll catch you on the next one.